I'm really excited today about what managers need to know to be successful. We have Shannon here today, which I'll give it over to her in just a second. But I really wanted to give a big shout out and a thank you to the Tri-Cities Regional Chamber, who's sponsoring January's Let's Talk Businesses, because they have the Tri-Cities Women in Business Conference coming up. And I know, I'm not sure where you are located, Moshe, but Sandy, I'm going over if you want to carpool. But anyway, a great event, full day of networking, of events, of breakout sessions. There's the Athena Awards at lunch. Highly recommend checking out if you're able to get to the area. Um, but with that, a little bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so if you are, it'll be emailed out to you afterwards. So if you missed something, if you wanted to listen to it again, if you want to just share it with a friend, please feel free to do so. In the interim, we want to make this interactive, so if you have questions, please feel free to ask them or type them in. But in the interim, if you could mute yourself, especially if you have loud background noises, that would be really great. If you're having trouble hearing us for any reason, in the go-to training control panel, there's an audio pane, and there's a phone call or computer audio. Highly recommend phone call if you're having issues, because sometimes it cuts in and out. And then, like I said, there's two ways to ask questions, and please feel free to do that. You can either raise your hand and you can ask it, verbally. You can unmute yourself and just ask it, or you can type it into the chat box, and we will get it. And I'll help Shannon. I'll help alert you to those. So a little bit about the Washington Center for Women in Business. We are an SBA-funded women's business center, and really we're here to help women that want to start a business, or if they're already an established business, help grow their business or help them gain the knowledge and the skills that they need to be as successful as they can be. And that can be on a variety of topics, anywhere from the startup planning, the growth stages, social media, marketing plans, and especially those really fun finance topics, cash flow, balance sheets, knowing your financial statements. We do this through workshops, either in person or online like this one, and then a lot of one-on-one coaching sessions where, today we'll kind of be talking in generalities, what businesses in general could do, what managers in general could do. But when you're one-on-one, then we're going to talk about you specifically and what is your goal and how can we get you there. Every session the first session with us is free. Every session after that is $25. But if that is a barrier for you, especially a lot of times in startup, or if you have hit some financial snags, sometimes that's just not doable. We do have scholarships available. So please let us know. Either Christine Buckley, the business coach, which her contact information is on the screen there, or myself can get you set up with that. And we do cover the entire state of Washington. So we're located in Lacey, Washington. But if you're located somewhere else and you'd like to work with us, you don't have to drive all the way here. I promise. You can. We do a lot of phone counseling or Skype. So with that, I'll stop talking about myself and give it over to you, Shannon.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I am very excited to be here and to be asked to present. I am a human resources professional. I've been in business and management and HR for 20 plus years. And today what I want to do is I just want to talk to you about some concepts that I run into quite a bit with managers and coaching and counseling, and some primary things that you need to know to be successful. And the thing I like about this particular presentation is it doesn't matter how small your organization is, how large your organization is, or how many people you have. These are all things that everyone can do and implement. And like I said, if you just have one person or multiple, and these are things that come up a lot, and I'm hoping that you will find helpful. I'm a very interactive speaker, so if you have questions, please ask. We'd be more than happy to stop at any time during the presentation and address those. We'll also have a time at the end where you can ask questions too. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to talk about, where there seems to be confusion with employers and some new employers, is exempt and non-exempt status for employees, and kind of what that looks like and what it means exactly. Does anybody want to chat about that or tell me what their thoughts are? No? Okay, well, we can go ahead and move forward, no worries. So if you have an exempt employee, my position is exempt. I'm the Director of Human Resources for a healthcare organization. So basically an exempt level staff member is salary. So with that, you're paying them for the job that they're performing. You're not paying them on an hourly basis. And then your non-exempt employees are your hourly employees, right? And so that's the difference between exempt and non-exempt. And when we look at these positions, some of the things that come up quite frequently are lunches. And lunches come up often with non-exempt level staff. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the laws and the regulations saying that after so many hours, employees have to have breaks and lunches and things like that. What I run into with small businesses or with businesses that run 24/7, a question that comes up quite frequently is, can I ask my non-exempt employees to work through their lunches? And the answer is yes, you can. So the law outlines that your breaks and your meal periods and things like that, but the law also recognizes that there are small businesses, or I'll use my own industry, for example. We run 24/7 and we have a night shift. And sometimes our night shift nurses aren't able to take a lunch because you have someone call in sick or something happens. And so the law states that you can actually have your non-exempt employees work through their lunch hour. You can ask them to do that. The key to this is compensation. So if you do that, you need to make sure that you're compensating your employees at the overtime rate or whatever it is that your policies and procedures outline. So the next thing I want to talk about is, let's talk about exempt level staff and how many hours you can require them to work. So your salaried staff, does anybody know how many hours you can require your salaried staff to work? If I said 40 hours a week, that seems reasonable, right? So what if I asked you if they were eligible to work for 60 hours every week? Does that seem reasonable? Does anyone have any objections to that? Okay. So what if I asked you if you could require an exempt level staff member to work 100 hours a week? What would you guys say to that? Does anybody want to chime in?
They're all being quiet.
It is awfully quiet.
So it's like a lot of hours, though.
It does. And so let's talk about that. So the law is completely silent on how many hours you can require an exempt level staff member to work. Now, if you're asking me if I would recommend this, my answer is no. I think during peak times, we can all push it for a while, but it's going to impact your recruiting and a variety of different things. But my point with this is that your exempt level staff, again, they're paid to do a job, and you can require them to work as many hours as you need them to make sure that that job actually gets completed. So the next thing that I want to talk about, where there's some confusion with employers, is right to work state versus at-will doctrine. People tend to get these two things confused. And so I just want to provide a little bit of clarity on these two topics. So a right to work state really has to do with collective bargaining agreements and those individuals that deal with unions. And what a right to work state states is that even if you have a collective bargaining unit in place, you cannot deny an employee or an applicant from applying for that position. And you can also, if they do apply for the position and they get the position, these individuals are not required to join a union. Interestingly enough, Washington is not a right-to-work state. So you may encounter an employer that has it has representation in place, so they have a CBA in place, and it's perfectly legal for them to bring on an employee and have that employee become part of that collective bargaining agreement. Generally, this happens within 30 to 45 days. If the employee refuses to become part of that collective bargaining agreement, then as an employer, we actually have to release them. So that's a little bit about right to work states. My guess is that many of you probably don't deal with unions, but the reason that we're talking about this today is because people will tell me, well, you know, they'll take right to work state and confuse it with at-will doctrine. And at-will doctrine is completely different. So at-will doctrine assumes that both the employer and the employee are free agents who may terminate the employment relationship at any time for any reason. Stating that you are an at-will employer, I would highly recommend that you have that somewhere in your offer letter. A lot of people don't include it in their offer letter, but if you ever have to terminate an employee for any reason, this is just kind of an education piece and a way to make sure that you're covered with the law so the employee can't come back and say, well, they never told me they were an at-will employer. So if you don't have that in your offer letter, you may want to take a look at implementing that or putting that in. As long as we're talking about offer letters, a lot of people use a probationary period. Many of you may have a 90-day probationary period or something like that. There was recently some cases that came out where an individual had surpassed, past their 90-day probationary period, and later down the road there were some issues with their performance, and the individual brought forth that, well, they had passed their probationary period, and the definition of probation is after you pass that, you're free and clear. And so that was some interesting verbiage and some interesting legislation that came out with that court case. But what I recommend to employers is to change probationary to introductory. And that way you can avoid any issues with that. So that's just kind of a little bit of an aside there. So let's talk a little bit more about at-will doctrine. At-will also allows employees to resign at any time. And a little known fact that people really don't know is if you have a contract in place with an employee, say a contract with a physician's assistant or maybe an ARMP, a lot of those individuals run under contracts. There's this thought process there that they can't get out of the contract, that they're locked into it. At-will actually states that even if an employee is under contract, that they can get out of that contract, that we can't hold them to that. So that's something that employers don't necessarily advertise, but I just want to make you aware of that in case you do have contract employees and this comes up. Employees can actually exercise that right. So in talking about at-will doctrine, it's important to realize that as employers, our freedoms have eroded over time. And what I mean by that is even though Washington is an at-will state and technically you can release an individual for any reason at any time, if you've ever dealt with unemployment, you need to have clear documentation that you've provided opportunity for the employee to turn it around, and coaching and counseling and things like that. I'm sure many of you have received that lovely set of paperwork for unemployment when this has happened, where you need to document everything and you need to provide them information as to why maybe you've had to fire an employee. So again, even though we are at-will employers and this is an at-will state with releasing staff, I always coach and counsel and recommend to employers that you do go through your disciplinary process and that you document everything, because at the end, it's just going to make your life a little bit easier if you're dealing with that unemployment piece. And it'll protect you in the long run too if there's any thought that an employee might come back and say something different. You can provide documentation and say no, that you did everything you possibly could to get the employee up to where they needed to be. And it's not only that, but something else too is it's fair to the employee as well. If people don't know where they're failing and they don't know where they need to improve, you're not going to get them to that next step. So I'm a huge proponent of documentation. You'll kind of see that as a theme as we work through today. Does anybody have any questions about right to work state versus at will doctrine, kind of what that looks like, maybe some experiences or clarity? Wow, you guys are a quiet group. So let's talk about helping underperforming staff achieve success. This is something that I'm extremely passionate about. I love for people to be successful. It makes everybody's jobs easier. And my ultimate goal in my position and everything that I do is mentorship and helping people grow. Even though it's hard, I find it really exciting when people are able to leave an organization because we've provided them with everything that we possibly can and they go on to the next opportunity. I think that's great, and that makes me feel like we've done a good job as an agency, especially if we don't have any further opportunities for them. So when you're trying to help underperforming staff achieve success, the key thing to remember is communication. And I always find it interesting when I have a manager who comes to me and they tell me, they're like, Shannon, you know what? I'm done with Susie Cream Cheese. I can't take it anymore. She's not, she's not performing. She's not getting to the level that I need to get her to. And she's not doing all these things, right? The first question that you're always going to get from me is, does she know? Does she know she's underperforming? And 9 times out of 10, the response that I get back is just kind of this blank, a little bit deer in the headlights look. And my most memorable situation was I had a manager actually tell me, well, she should know. And I found that pretty fascinating because it's like, okay, well, how should Susie know? So we had to start from ground zero. So again, does the employee know that they are underperforming? So the first step when you have someone who's not reaching your expectations is to have a conversation with that individual. And this all goes back to documentation and providing that feedback to the employee. Really, if you have a good 60, 90, 30, 60, 90 evaluation in place, you should be having these communications with this new staff member, if they're new, from the very beginning. So the expectations should be clear. Your job description should be clear. Everything should be clear on the expectations, which makes these conversations all that much easier to have. So once you determine that you have an employee that's not performing up to your standards or the expectations of the position, and you have that initial discussion with them, letting them know kind of, what they're lacking. Maybe they have difficulty with follow through, so you come with some examples, and you have that initial discussion. Set up a standing meeting with them to discuss and monitor the progress. And there's a couple of reasons that I would suggest this. The first reason is that you need to figure out a way to monitor that progress. You can't just have, these types of conversations are not just a one and done. They take consistent coaching to get individuals to the level where you need them to get. So you want to set up that standing meeting. My suggestion is that you make it on the same day, same time. Just makes it easier to track. Schedules are crazy, and it makes it easier for the employee. And then once you set that time and that date, make an effort not to move that meeting time around, because what that'll do is if you're constantly moving that, they're going to feel that they're not a priority and they're not going to take this seriously. When individuals ask me about time frames for standing meetings, if you have an employee who is really struggling, you may want to do them weekly, but my suggestion is a bi-weekly meeting and definitely no more than a month. Bi-weekly gives the staff member some time to provide you with some wins and some documentation and kind of how they're doing in their progress. If you go out a month, it's been my experience that those meetings tend to get canceled a little more frequently. And again, when you do that, the employee doesn't really take this process seriously, and you really want them to take this seriously. The other thing when you're setting this stuff up is get the employee involved. Engage them to come up with ideas for training opportunities. And what I mean by this is, as adult learners, we all learn a little bit differently. And generally by this point in our lives, we've kind of figured out how we best learn. I'm pretty interactive. Books, tend to put me to sleep a little bit. I'm not really good with that. So I like my trainings to be interactive. I like seminars and group trainings where there's discussion. I like to learn from others. That works really well for me. And you as their manager, you should also kind of have a little bit of a beat on how these individuals learn. So when you're engaging them to come up with ideas, give them some examples and some ideas. Maybe it's webinars, maybe it's trainings in town, possibly a conference. It's going to depend on your budget and how you structure your trainings. But you want them to get involved. And I want my employees to come to me with a list. And generally what I tell them is a list of like 7 to 10 training opportunities. And what I hear a lot of is, oh my gosh, that's a lot. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, it is a lot to come up with, but we want them to give you as the manager some opportunities, because you're going to have to schedule these. You're going to have to make sure you have coverage. We have to budget for these types of items, right? So have them come up with that list, but just don't leave it on them. As their manager, you also need to come up with a list of some training opportunities, because what they think they need help with may be completely different from what you're seeing that they actually need help with. But again, you want them to feel engaged. You want them to feel involved. So that's why you want to get them to start thinking about this. And lastly with this, you want to encourage, support, and walk alongside them in this process. And I've had people ask me, well, exactly what do you mean by this? And when I talk about encouraging a staff member to go get the training and really walking alongside them, what I'm talking about is that when they go to a training, you as the manager should be following up with them and asking them, hey, how did that training go? Did it work for you? What did you think? Did you have a good time? This just shows that you're interested. You're interested and you're excited about getting them up to the level that they need to be, and they're going to feel supported. And that's going to go a long way with your staff member, especially if you have someone who's kind of maybe a little bit on the fence about going to these trainings. Supporting them is going to be key with that. And also, along with support, when you have a staff member and you've scheduled a training for them, or they've scheduled the training and you've blocked out that time, I've seen managers go, well, I know I gave you time on January 31st, but budget end is that time, and we really can't afford to have you gone. Keep in mind, if you do something like that, that it translates to the employee that you're not actually as supportive as you're saying, and that derails that whole encouragement piece. So you want to be really careful with that, and that's one of the big support things. Be careful when you're scheduling and make sure there's adequate coverage. And if they do have certain deadlines, either work around those or find someone else that can fill in for that. And then last but not least, walking alongside them in this process. it just goes back to supporting that, encouraging and supporting them. If you have an employee who maybe you feel you're sending to these trainings, but you kind of wonder if they're taking notes or kind of, if they're getting anything out of these trainings, one of the things that I really enjoy doing after I talk to an employee and they're telling me, oh my gosh, Shannon, it was amazing, the speakers were great, tell me all the stuff they learned, I will ask them to speak at the next staff meeting or the next employee meeting. And it, doesn't have to be long. A lot of people don't like public speaking. It terrifies them. You don't have to have a PowerPoint or do any of these things, but get them to stand up and share a little bit about what they learned from that training. And not only is it going to be good for the employee that you sent to solidify what they've learned, you're going to get more bang for your buck, really, because you're having them educate the rest of your staff and talk about things that they learned. And even if the rest of the staff isn't necessarily having a problem in any of these areas, your staff will appreciate that you're sending this employee to training and trying to get them trained up, because chances are they've been kind of maybe carrying them along or, supporting them in this. So it's a really good culture thing as well for your staff. So this is my little diagram for success. I love this. This is what you should be doing with your employees and with staff, especially with underperforming. You need to start the process, think about the process, analyze, and then plan for it, and try, do, and do again, and keep on doing. This is how we reach those levels of success. So like I said, it's not a one and done. It's a constant thing with not only underperforming staff, but your staff in general as you try to grow them into these positions. Anybody have any questions or comments about underperforming staff, or even someone that they're dealing with that's not performing, that maybe you're having some issues with, that you'd like some feedback on?
One thing I will say is whenever we go to national conferences, we're all expected to kind of deliver what we've learned, just little tidbits, like you said. And one thing I remember going to my first one and I didn't know, so maybe setting that expectation beforehand that, hey, remember that you're going to be sharing that with the staff, because then it was a complete panic moment for me. Like, are my notes good enough to share with people? But then there was one question here. Is there a place for like video library or a catalog of videos for training, maybe in things like safety, other generic topics like Excel and computer, things that people can access or maybe pay a subscription to?
Sure. I'm not really sure about a video library, but I will tell you this, as far as safety, if you contact OSHA, they have fabulous resources for safety training. They will come out and they will talk to your staff, and they're not looking to, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want OSHA in my office. Well, that initial phone call, and if you engage them to come out and do training, they're not looking for, for things to fine you with or whatever. They're absolutely wonderful. I've used them many times before. And then also, our local work source here, they are great with Excel training, and they've provided my organization with many online trainings. They will even test applicants for free. So you can make sure that they have the skills and everything that you're looking for. Because I mean, how many of us have hired people and they're like, oh, I'm an Excel guru, and you get them in and it's maybe not the case. So WorkSource is also a wonderful resource for that. And if you contact your local agency, they will provide you with video and different platforms, because you can do it right at the office, or send staff out for testing, or send staff out for training, or again, you can do it on online. So those would be my recommendations. And those 2 resources are free.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's talk about employee engagement. I'm sure that you all recognize how critical employee engagement is. And employee engagement is one of my favorite topics. It's something I'm really passionate about. When you have an engaged workforce that is excited to come to work, your whole culture changes, and it's honestly, it's a really beautiful thing. Now, a lot of people, when I talk about employee engagement, they're like, oh, okay, Shannon, you're talking about, company potlucks and, craft day or whatever, some of these things. And that's not actually my definition of employee engagement. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important, because you do have employees who, they love the Super Bowl potluck, or we do kind of a spring launch where we do a picnic in the park type thing. Employees do appreciate those types of things. But what I'm talking about with employee engagement is employee commitment and how well they participate in work and longevity. And what it comes down to is when you have engaged staff, they are going to do whatever they can for your organization and the benefit of their internal and external customers. So we talk frequently about going the extra mile. A lot of you maybe have customer service based industries, and I was a customer service manager for years. And I always knew when I had engaged employees, because these are the ones who would get the phone calls and they got the completely different department or wherever they were calling was couldn't be any more left field. And my staff member would take care of them anyway. They would meet their need, and they would go that extra mile. So that's really what an engaged workforce looks like. Wow, okay, I think I hit one of my stuff here. I apologize. So effectively engaging employees, I hate to break this to you guys, as I hate to break it to my own managers, but it starts with your managers and your supervisors. So it starts with you guys who are running these businesses, who are running these teams and doing these things. And something that's probably a little bit of a cliche, but it's the truth, is that an engaged workforce starts from the top down. Because we look to, as employees, as line staff, we look to our leadership to define all sorts of things, to define customer service, to define, how we should act and how we lead, and all of these things. So a critical piece is making sure that your managers and your supervisors are engaged. And the 3 keys to effectively engaging your staff is to inspire them, empower them, and develop them. And so when I'm talking about this and I'm presenting and I'm doing management training, one of the questions that I get, I think about 99% of the time is, okay, Shannon, well, that sounds great, but how do you inspire an individual? Because it sounds a little bit, it sounds like a really pretty word, but it sounds a little bit ominous in that. So when I'm talking about inspiring people, you need to find out what's important. You need to find out what's important to your staff and what's important to that individual. And I'll give you an example. So I had an employee, and they really wanted to learn about project management. And they were passionate about it, passionate enough in the aspect that they were excited to learn and wanted to jump in and do and help. So in knowing this, what I did was I found them a mentor within the organization that did project management and had them work with them. And this particular mentor gave them little pieces, right? And projects that they could do to help keep that fire in them lit and get them excited about this. And so as they were giving them little pieces and little projects, and this went well because you want to make sure it's going well for your organization, they empowered them to make some decisions. Now, a lot of people get really concerned when I talk about empower, because they think I'm, saying, oh, well, just let them run a project. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to provide some parameters for them to make decisions within, but empower them to make some of those little decisions. And they definitely need to keep you in the loop and do, follow up and let you know what they're doing. But if you're inspiring them to grow to this position, then you need to give them some ability to make some decisions so they can really grow in that role and feel like they're progressing. If all of this is going well, then lastly, you want to develop them. And what I mean by that is you want to develop those skills. So maybe you are sending them to a conference or a training. Maybe you have them spend more time with their mentor, and they're developing in these areas. When you have an engaged workforce and you're doing these three things, it does a couple of things for you in the organization. When you have someone vacate a position, and in most cases, people vacate and don't give you a lot of lead time. If you're fortunate enough to have an employee who is able to give you maybe a month or a couple of months, then it allows you to go out and recruit for that position. But I'm a huge fan of growing employees from within, because if you have your rock stars and they show an interest in another area, to lead effectively, you want to grow them in that area, because it's a win for you and it's a win for the employee. You're going to retain them longer. They know your organization, they know you know their work ethic. And so if you can grow them and develop them and move them into other positions that are vacant, that's just going to be a huge win for you and your organization. And a benefit of this as well is your employees are your billboard. So when they're out in the community and they are raving about how wonderful your organization is, how engaged you are as a manager and the growth opportunities, your recruitment is going to get a lot better, because everyone's going to be vying to come in and work for your organization. And that's a beautiful thing. So how do you do this? How do you find out what inspires people and get engaged with your staff? Some time ago, manage by walking around, that was a really big buzzword, right? And I haven't heard too much of it lately. And I think that's really unfortunate, because this allows you to know what's going on in your organization. You need to keep a pulse on your group. Keep a good pulse on your organization and your team to know what they're doing. And let me tell you, your team will also appreciate it. I worked for an organization, and I'm a storyteller, by the way, as well, but I think this is how I learn. But I worked for an organization, and we had a manager that came in, and this particular manager would come in after everyone had gotten there, come in the back door, and go into their office and shut the door. And then they would leave before everyone left for the day, and they would go out the back door and no one saw them. So now we're not sure what this particular individual did about bathroom time or anything like that, because we never saw them. And on the rare occasion that we did see them, we called it a sighting. So this causes a couple of problems in an organization. First and foremost, we were all terrified of going to this particular individual because they hadn't built any relationship. And we didn't know if they were approachable. We didn't know the communication style. So it was really unfortunate. And this individual had no idea what we were interested in, what inspired us, what we were doing development-wise for our careers, which in turn helps the organization. So that was really unfortunate. So I would encourage you to get out and talk to staff. Maybe, if you don't necessarily go to certain staff meetings because they're not in your department, or possibly they're not convenient. Try to get to those meetings so staff gets comfortable with you if they're not. And this is going to allow you to find out how to effectively engage them. Lastly, be an active listener. So I'm one of those people, I'm a fidgeter. I like to, anything that's on my desk that I can play with, paper clips, pens, anything like that. I get distracted really easily. Like I said, I'm kind of fidgety. So being an active listener is was pretty challenging for me, and that was something that I really had to work on and focus on. So some tips and tricks that I would tell you that I do. I have a conference room right off of my office. And so when someone comes in and they want to have a conversation, I remove myself from my desk and we get up and we go in another room and we have a conversation. I leave behind my phone, any electronic devices, anything that I could possibly play with, so I can be actively engaged in what the individual is trying to tell me. Because if you have someone who's coming to you with a legitimate concern or an issue or a growth opportunity, and you're answering emails, your phone's going off, maybe you're texting, even if you're playing with something like me and my paper clips, people they have the perception that, gosh, Shannon's really not interested in what I'm doing and she's not listening to me. And even though she talks about, growing and developing my career, she seems really distracted. And what happens in these situations is these people just quit coming to you. And if they quit coming to you and they feel that you're not interested in their growth and development and having an engaged workforce, then they vote with their feet and they leave your organization. And we all know how expensive and how difficult recruiting is. So that's the last thing that we want. A big key here is also supporting work-life balance when you're effectively engaging your staff. Managers tend to get really nervous when I talk about work-life balance because they think that, I'm talking about allowing people to run their own schedules or do these types of things, work from home and all of this stuff. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you do talk about this in your organization, that you're an organization that really supports work-life balance, make sure that you actively do that. You may have an employee that comes to you, and my experience has been I have a lot of staff members who are having elderly parents right now, and they're having to care for their elderly parents. And so can you make an accommodation? I've made accommodations where people have just switched their lunch hour because there's a shift change in caregivers, and it happens not at the noon hour, but it happens at 11 o'clock in the morning, or it happens at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Can you accommodate that? And that's what it's all about. You as an organization, does it work for you? And is that something you can accommodate? Tying back into, yes, we realize that supporting work-life balance is important. This is one of my favorite quotes. Leaders become great not because of their power, but because of their ability to empower others. So I just love that. If you empower your staff, it's really going to go a long way. The last topic I just want to spend a little bit of time chatting with you about today is conflict resolution with you as the mediator. I'm sure many of you have had conflict with your staff and within your department. Maybe somebody isn't getting along. And organizations really like mediation, especially with in-house staff, because it's free that we can do that. And to get an outside mediator is pretty expensive. So the thing to keep in mind about mediation is that mediation is completely voluntary and the parties decide the outcome. You're looking for a cordial win-win solution. And as a mediator, this is something that you run this, you don't make decisions or anything like that. It's the individuals that have to come to their own decision. With negotiation, it's all about reframing the situation in order to get people to shift their positions. So it's all about getting people to see the other individual's side and getting them to come to a win-win. 85% of mediation is done strictly because there was a misunderstanding and a lack of communication or some sort of communication breakdown. That's been my personal experience. So there's 5 steps to a successful mediation. And your first step is to determine whether to speak to the individuals as a group or one-on-one before you enter into the mediation. Unfortunately, there's not a magic bullet or a formula for this. It's going to depend on your individuals and their relationships that are going to be involved in this mediation. If you have 2 individuals that have never had a good working relationship and it's pretty contentious, then my recommendation would be to meet with them individually before you actually go into mediation. If you have some individuals that they have a good working relationship, but you know, maybe someone just took a statement wrong or something like that, but they have that relationship already built, you may be able to just go right in and speak with them as a group. One of the things that you want to determine when you're meeting with them one-on-one is you want to make sure that you know what the actual issue is. Possibly Joe didn't support Susie in a decision or a launch that was done at an all-staff meeting, and someone's upset about that because they thought they were going to be supported. You want to figure out what actually the core issue is before you bring them in, so you as a mediator know that and you can keep bringing them back to that particular situation. You also want to know what a win looks like for each individual. A lot of times it's just an apology, and a lot of times it's just an acknowledgement that, hey, you didn't support me, and I want you to just acknowledge that you didn't support me. So it's really important that you set the stage before you go into this mediation. And what I mean by that is set some ground rules. You know, set a time that this mediation is going to last only an hour. And this is what we're going to discuss. And let them know that you as the mediator, you're running this meeting. So if you say, you know, we're going to stop this mediation now, they need to abide by that. Let them know that there's not going to be any, you won't tolerate any sort of inappropriate language or anything like that at the beginning of this mediation. I like to set the stage when I'm meeting with the individuals one-on-one and let them know the ground rules. And then I like to set the stage when I have both of the individuals there before the mediation starts. That way they're very clear, and chances of them doing anything that you don't want them doing, it really lessens that. I'm not going to say it solves it completely, but it really helps with that. So the next step would be the communication stage. And so this goes back to reframing as well. I'm going to use the example of that someone didn't support someone in a meeting. So what I'll do is I will open up the mediation, and I'll start by saying, you know, Joe, it's my understanding that you didn't support Susie in this new product launch. This is what she states happened. Can you walk me through and tell me a little bit about what that looked like? So Joe's going to tell his story. And once that happens, what I like to do is I like to go to Susie and I'm like, okay, Susie, so you heard this, is this accurate? What actually happened? And she'll tell her side of the story. And a lot of times it's just a confusion where Joe doesn't even realize he wasn't supporting Susie. He's thinking, gosh, you know, I thought I did a great thing. I thought, you know, my response that we table it and we go back to the drawing board to address these issues was perfect. I didn't realize that you were feeling unsupported. You know, at that point, her feelings are acknowledged. Maybe she just wants an apology and she just wants a path forward to know, you know, okay, well, where are we going to go from here? And now I can work with you again, because during these things, people generally aren't talking to one another. So they can move forward and it's respectful. So that's where, again, that negotiation takes place. They can find out how they can move forward. The most important part of a negotiation, well, let me rephrase that. I'm not going to say the most important, but a critical piece is your closure stage. So once they reach an agreement and a path forward, what I tend to do is I have a document I'm working on, I type up the agreement and the closure, and then I have each one of them sign it, provide a copy to them, and then I keep a copy in their personnel file. And the reason I do this is because sometimes people like to bring up past history and past issues. So if this happens in your situation, you can go to those employees and say, hey, you guys, we've already discussed this. We have a path forward. We closed it. We're moving on. So they can know that this has been closed, and it gives you that that backup and that authority as a manager or supervisor, so you don't have to go down that road again, because mediation's time consuming and it's draining. So you want to make sure to seam these up really nicely so you have some good backup so you don't have to do this again. That, ladies, is the end of my presentation for managers, and just a few key things that I would hope that you would take with you and know. If you didn't know or have those tools already, I hope that you do. And if there's any questions, I have some time. I scheduled a little bit of time after, so I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you do have.
Well, thank you, Shannon. So I definitely encourage everybody, if you have questions, feel free to type those in, or now would be a great time. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask them if it's too long to type. But thank you, Shannon. I think that was some really great information about kind of the background about the employees, and then also kind of how to deal with it. I think that those are some key points that I think we've all felt painful at times. So wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope to see you guys at Women in Business on the 31st. If you were on the call and you do find yourself there, please find me and introduce yourself. I would love to meet you all in person.
Will you guys have a booth there or find you at your breakout maybe?
You can find me at my breakout meeting.
Okay.
So yeah, I will be speaking there. My topic is Women Master Negotiators, and it's going to be a really fun topic. Highly encourage you guys to come if you do have the availability. We're going to have a really good time.
That one sounds wonderful. Thank you. Well,
Absolutely.
yeah, so I'll go ahead and end the